everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you all back to another English video where we are going to be continuing with our studies of the Brit Hadashah. In today's video, we are going to be analyzing the rest of chapter 14 from the Good News of Mark. But before we begin to read these verses, first we are going to recapitulate what we learned in the previous study, which was based on chapters 13 and the first 11 verses of chapter 14. And the title for this study was Watching to Save Ourselves from Destruction, Recognizing Yeshua and His Authority. In this chapter 13, we first started reading that Yeshua teaches to his disciples about the signs that were going to happen, which represented the final days. Yeshua mentions that these signs were regarding to wars, famines, betrayals, persecution of believers in the faith that Yeshua taught, earthquakes, etc. We saw in this study that all of these signs or prophecies that Yeshua speaks in this chapter have already been fulfilled, and almost all of them continue to be fulfilled in our current days. For example, in our current days, we can see that wars are still going on, betrayals, famines, earthquakes, etc. But the important thing that we learned from this section of verses is the importance of remembering that although these signs were fulfilled and continue to be fulfilled, it does not mean that we should fear, worry, or even be scared and think that the world is ending, as many people have this mentality. But rather, just as Yeshua teaches in these verses, these signs should be as a reminder that no one knows the day nor the hour of his coming, only the Father does. And that we must take advantage of the time that we have of life so that we can obey, consecrate ourselves, pray, and watch, and most importantly, have that communion with our Creator. So in this way, when the Messiah comes for the second time and brings just judgment to every soul, we can be worthy of receiving the heavenly promises that the Messiah taught to his disciples and that his disciples taught to the people of the nations. But if we do the opposite, if we live in sin, if we're not bearing good fruit, then when the Messiah comes and he finds us like the fig tree that was not giving good fruit, then we are going to be despised for the hardness of our hearts. We also read in this chapter 13 about a prophecy that Yeshua tells his disciples, which was already fulfilled in the year 70 after the Messiah. And this prophecy was regarding to the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. We saw in this prophecy that this destruction of the temple was something that had to happen because the religious groups of that time that were in charge of this temple had already made this place impure. They had contaminated this place, which from the beginning, as we mentioned in the previous study, in the Torah, we can read that the original purpose of this temple of Jerusalem was so that it can be kept as a pure and holy place where the presence of the Creator was going to dwell. But when Yeshua comes to this world and finds that the religious people had made this temple like a house of thieves, Yeshua confirms this in Matthew 21, verse 13. It is the reason why Yeshua says that this temple was going to be destroyed. We also read that Yeshua tells his disciples that the Creator was no longer going to be served in a physical temple, but rather everything was going to be, or the eternal was going to be served by spirit and truth, by faith. Just as Yeshua also tells the Samaritan woman in John 4, verse 23, where he says, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." In chapter 14, the first 11 verses, we read about Judah's betrayal towards the Messiah. We can read that Judah had planned and had agreed with the religious people that he was going to hand the Messiah over if they gave him money. Here we can see in this action of Judah that it represents what the human nature is like, which we let ourselves be carried away by our carnal desires. And in this case of Judas, we can see that his love for money was greater than remaining faithful and recognizing the Messiah. We also read in this chapter 14, the first 11 verses, that before Yeshua was going to be handed over to the Roman authorities, he first went through an anointment that was done by a woman in Bethany, where we read that this anointment was done with a perfume. And in all of this, we saw that it was important that Yeshua went through this preparation in this case, of the anointment. He had to go through it so that he can, his surrender that he was going to do could take place and could be perfect. Once again, let's remember that Yeshua's death or Yeshua's sacrifice was getting closer because the festivity of Pesach was approaching. So this is what we saw in chapter 13 and in the first 11 verses of chapter 14 of the Good News of Mark. In today's video, we are going to be studying the rest of chapter 14, and the title for this study is The True Korban Oppressed and Denied to Fulfill What Was Prophesied. In this chapter, we will be reading the beginning of the procedure that Yeshua was going through so that he can fulfill his surrender. First, we are going to be reading about the Passover meal or the Passover Seder that Yeshua had with his 12 disciples, which in the Bible it is also called as the Last Supper. In this meal, meal, we're going to be reading that Yeshua informs his disciples of what would happen to him in this Passover feast. We are also going to be reading that the Messiah tells his disciples about the representations that the elements that were eaten for this supper, for this seder, represented him. For example, we're going to be reading that the wine represents the blood, Yeshua's blood, that was going to be poured for the sins of others. We're also going to be reading that Yeshua says that the unleavened bread represents his body. Why? Because as we have studied in the Good News of Matthew, yeast represents sin. So when it says unleavened bread, it means a bread without yeast, which bread represents body. And in this case, unleavened bread represents a body without sin, which describes perfectly the Messiah, who was a person without sin, without fouls. So we're going to be reading other elements that Yeshua says that represent him. And we are also going to be reading in this chapter 14 that after this meal or after this supper, Yeshua tells Judah to do what he had already planned, what he had already proposed himself to do, which was to hand over the Messiah to the religious people so that they can kill him. We are also going to be reading that Yeshua says to Peter and to his disciples that they were going to abandon him when Yeshua was going to be arrested. However, we do read that Peter says that he was not going to abandon him, from which the Messiah tells him that he was mistaken, that Peter was going to deny him 3 times when he was going to be judged by the religious people. And this was fulfilled, and we're going to be reading that it was fulfilled in the last verses of this chapter. We are also going to be reading that Yeshua goes to the Mount of Olives with his disciples so that they can pray. And this was because Yeshua was already he was already understanding that his delivery or his sacrifice was getting closer. He understood that the suffering that he was going to have to go through physically was not going to be easy. We can even read in verse 36 that Yeshua tells the Father that if it's his will, he should make this cup pass, but that the will of the Creator be done and not his. Finally, we are going to be reading in this chapter 14 that Yeshua is taken before the Sanhedrin so that the religious people could quote unquote judge him and therefore have an excuse to kill him. In all of this that we're going to be reading in chapter 14, we're going to be seeing that Yeshua maintains himself in trust with the Father, and that everything that he says is not in a way so that he can free himself from death, because he understood that he had to give himself as a sacrifice. But rather, we're going to be seeing that he remains humble, and not only humble, but he also recognizes that he must give himself as a perfect sacrifice so that he can cover the sins of every soul that voluntarily and sincerity return to the eternal through him. With this introduction of what we are going to be seeing in this chapter 14, we're now going to begin reading verses 12 to 26. It says, "It was the first day of the feast of unleavened bread. That was the time to sacrifice the Passover lamb. Yeshua's disciples asked him, 'Where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover meal?' So he sent out 2 of his disciples. He told them, 'Go into the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. He will enter a house. Say to its owner, the teacher asks, "Where is my guest room? Where can I eat the Passover meal with my disciples?" Verse 15. He will show you a large upstairs room. It will have furniture and will be ready. Prepare for us to eat there." The disciples left and went into the city. They found things just as Yeshua had told them, so they prepared the Passover meal. When evening came, Yeshua arrived with his 12 disciples. While they were at the table eating, Yeshua said, "What I am about to tell you is true. One of you who is eating with me will hand me over to my enemies." Verse 19. The disciples became sad, and they began to say one by one, "Is it me?" Yeshua replied, "It is one of you. It is the one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But how terrible it will be for the one who hands over the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Verse 22. While they were eating, Yeshua took bread. He gave thanks and broke it. He handed it to his disciples and said, "Take it. This is my body." Then he took a cup of wine. He gave thanks and handed it to him. All of them drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant," Yeshua said. "It is poured out for many. What I am about to tell you is true. I won't drink wine with you again until the day I drink it in Elohim's kingdom." Verse 26. Then they sang a psalm and went out to the Mount of Olives. We first start reading in these verses that the festivity of Pesach and Matzot were approaching, or they were already happening. As we read in this, or as we have already studied in the Gospel of Matthew, this festivity of Pesach and Matzot was very important for the Israelites. That is why we read that Yeshua's disciples, before the festivity arrived, they were preparing for the seder, or the meal that was going to be given in to open the festivity of Pesach. And this was an important appointment, or it was a holy appointment, because it represented the exodus from Egypt that their ancestors had lived, and therefore it was commemorated. This event, we can read, it happened, this event about the liberation of Egypt, we can read it in Exodus 12. And for that reason, it is why we read that the Messiah and his disciples were preparing for the Pesach dinner. But in this occasion, the festival of Pesach would become a very important but also special time for the believers. Why? Well, because apart from the fact that it was a time of commemoration of the liberation of Egypt, Now it was going to be an allusion to the delivery that Yeshua was going to make. As we read in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Passover dinner, certain foods had to be prepared, which also alluded to what the Messiah was going to do. And one of those was a perfect lamb that had to be prepared and also offered to the Eternal. This lamb represented the Messiah because he was going to be sacrificed he was going to sacrifice himself so that he can give freedom to all soul that voluntarily and sincerity did teshuvah. And this offering or this sacrifice that Yeshua was going to do, it was going to bring freedom to every soul that was enslaved to this world. And it is also going to allow the soul to serve the Eternal fully and as he asks. Another element that is required for the festivity of matzot is unleavened bread, also called as matzah. This element also alludes to the Messiah, since yeast in the scriptures represents sin. So when it says unleavened bread, it means without sin and contamination, precisely describing the Messiah, who was a person who did not have sins, who did not have fouls, who was not contaminated. Another element that had to be eaten in this supper was the bitter herbs. And these represented the Messiah's sufferings that he was going to go through when he was going to offer himself as that perfect Korban. Also, we can read, or another thing that was essential or was important to be to drink in this supper was the wine, which represented the blood of the covenant that was shed to give us redemption. Another thing that we can read in this section of verses is that during this supper, Yeshua declares that one of his disciples was going to hand him over to the religious people. Here we can see that Yeshua knew very well what Judas was planning to do, which was to betray the Messiah for money. Yeshua tells his disciples that whoever was going to betray him was going to receive a judgment, a severe judgment. It is important to mention that this betrayal was something that had already been prophesied, so it was necessary for this prophecy to be fulfilled. However, in this occasion with Judas, he was not obligated, he was not forced to be the one to fulfill this betrayal of the Messiah, since it is important to understand that Judas did have the opportunity to either decide if he was going to give in to his carnal desires or if he was going to reject them and he was going to maintain himself in trust and in faithfulness towards the Messiah. But we read that Judas' decision was the opposite. Judas voluntarily, without any obligation, decided to go or to go for his carnal desires, which was to receive money in order for him to hand over Yeshua to the religious people. Seeing this attitude that Judas took, it gives us a clear and also important lesson, which is that we all have the freedom to make our own decisions. That is to say, that no one is forced to do bad decisions, no one is forced to believe in something, no one is forced to live in a certain way, etc. Every one of us have the liberty or the freedom to decide what we want to do with our lives or what we want to believe in. If we let ourselves be carried away by our desires and emotions, then we will act we will act proudly, we would act with ego, and we are not going to be those obedient souls towards the Creator. The Eternal gives everyone the opportunity to choose the right path and return to Him, but it is up to the person to decide if they want to accept this opportunity or if they are going to deny it. We can even take the example of we can take as an example the words that the Eternal tells Cain in Genesis 4 verse 7, where he says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Another thing that we can read in verse 26 is that to conclude the Pesach Seder, Yeshua and his disciples sing psalms. In this verse, it is not specifically mentioned what psalm they sang, but it is believed that these psalms were regarding to messianic prophetic psalms that alluded to the festivity of Pesach and Matzot. We can even read in a commentary of the Dictionary Strong that it is said that traditionally, to conclude the Pesach Seder, the Psalm 115 to 118 was sung by the people who commemorated this or who kept this Seder of Pesach. Continuing with verses 27 to 31, we read that when they finished with the Seder and they finished singing the songs, they go up to the Mount of Olives, which was located in the Kidron Valley east of Jerusalem. And in this section of verses, we can read that Yeshua tells his disciples that they were going to leave that they were going to abandon Yeshua when he was going to be arrested by the Roman authorities. We can even read that in these verses that Yeshua specifically tells Peter that he was going to deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed at dawn. And all of this that Yeshua says in these verses is precisely what happened. We can read in these verses that the disciples, when the Roman authorities came, they scattered, they left Yeshua, they abandoned him. And even when Yeshua was in the moment where he was upon the Sanhedrin and he was being judged, the disciples, except for Peter, they abandoned him completely because they feared of what they could have went through if they had been recognized as Yeshua's disciples. And in Peter's situation, we can read that although later on in these verses, we're going to read that although he did from afar followed the whole procedure that Yeshua was going through. However, the moment that the people that were in this Sanhedrin recognized that he had been one of Yeshua's disciples, he denied being one of them. In other words, he denied the Messiah 3 times, just as we can read that Yeshua tells him that was going to happen in these verses. In these verses, another thing that we can read is that Yeshua quotes a prophecy that was given by the prophet Zechariah in Zechariah 13 verse 7, where the prophecy says, "Awake, sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, declares the Lord Almighty. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones." As we have been studying throughout these 2 Gospels of Matthew and Mark, is that Yeshua in various occasions clarifies that in his life, everything that had been announced by the prophets regarding to his coming and to his ministry had to be fulfilled. That is to say that nothing can be avoided, especially or much less his delivery as a perfect Korban. In this prophecy that the Messiah mentions, we can understand that the Eternal did not want the disciples to leave Jerusalem without any reason or leave Jerusalem in fear of what they were going to go through, the persecutions that were going to happen after the Messiah's death. But rather the Eternal knew that due to the human condition, they should first be anointed by the Holy Spirit of the Eternal. So in that way, they could be guided by it, and also they can be provided with the words that they were going to announce, that they were going to teach to the people of the nations, and that in some occasions they were going to be in need of those words when they were going to be when they were going to be confronting the authorities of their times. We can read in this gospel, and in the previous gospel of Matthew, we've read that Yeshua tells them repeatedly that their mission was to carry out the message of the good news to the nations. That was what their calling was for them, to teach the message of redemption that the Messiah came to teach to the people of Israel, and now the disciples and apostles had to teach it to the people of the nations. But for this to happen, so in order for them to be prepared not only mentally but also spiritually, it was important for them that they received the Holy Spirit of the Messiah. And for this, it is why Yeshua tells them that after Yeshua's death, they could not leave Jerusalem, but rather stay in Jerusalem, receive the Holy Spirit of the Eternal, and then they were going to start fulfilling with their calling. In verses 29 to 30, we can read that Peter tells the Messiah that even if all the disciples abandoned him on the day of his arrest, he was not going to leave him. But the Messiah, we can read that he answers him saying that it was going to be the contrary. Peter was going to deny him, not one time, but 3 times. Peter spoke. We can see, or analyzing this situation, this event that happened with Peter and the way that he acted, we can see that he spoke in a hurry, and he did not stop to listen carefully to the words of the Messiah, but rather he was trying to seem like he was going to be with the Messiah through difficult times. But in the end of this chapter 14, we're going to see that he contradicted himself. In analyzing and reading Peter's attitude, it shows us, and it also gives us a very valuable teaching of how it is how the human condition is, which we act because us as humans, we often, especially as young people, we often act in a way where when we are receiving an exhortation or an advice from a parent or even an adult, we think that we are in the right. We think that we have the answer to everything, and therefore we respond without analyzing, without understanding, without taking the moment to process everything that is being said to us, without going to the scriptures, analyzing the scriptures, and see what it says regarding to the situation that we're going through, etc. It is important that we do all of that first before we decide to act in the moment, before we decide to open our mouth and say something that is being said based on an emotion and without maturity. And it is important for us to do all of this, so in this way we don't suffer the consequences of our rebellion. After all, it is rebellion. After rebellion, thinking that we are correct when it's not like that. It is important that we also understand what we can read in 1 Corinthians 10:12, where it says that if we think that we are firm in the faith, we must stop and observe carefully for us to not fall, for us to not stumble. And this teaches us to not get carried away by our emotions, but rather to stop and analyze, to listen to the advice, to the exhortations, to the teachings that we are receiving, to go to the scriptures, analyze them, what it says, and then use our knowledge to serve the Eternal in the right way, because that is what will bring for our lives a true blessing. Just as we can read in James 1 verses 19 to 21, where it says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everything should be quick. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that Elohim desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Another thing that we can understand from these verses is that not even a disciple could prevent this delivery of the Messiah. And even this was something very clear that the Messiah understood. The Almighty wanted the Messiah to go through this affliction, and he knew that the disciples would feel this a fear of what they were going, a fear because of their humanity, because they were going to see everything that was going to start occurring with the Messiah. And although Yeshua knew that his disciples loved him sincerely, he warned them that he warned them of what was going to happen to them, and that it was important for them to be prepared, and to also that when they were going to go through all the sufferings and tribulations, that it was going to be because of Yeshua, because of his teachings, and that they should not let themselves be dominated by fear, by emotions, by egoism, by authority, but rather that they should gather together from time to time, Yeshua tells them that they should gather after Yeshua's death, that they should all gather, stay united, and wait all together until Yeshua resurrected from the dead. And then they would be guided by Yeshua on how they were going to receive the Holy Spirit, how they had to prepare themselves mentally and spiritually, and how they were going to fulfill their calling. So this is what we can understand from these verses. Continuing with verses 32 to 42, it says, Yeshua and his disciples went to a place called Gethsemane. Yeshua said to them, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him. He began to be very upset and troubled. My soul is very sad. I feel close to death. He said to them, "Stay here, keep watch." He went a little further. Then he fell to the ground. He prayed that if possible, the hour might pass by him. He said, "Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup of suffering away from me. But let what you want to be done, not what I want." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for an hour? Watch and pray, then you won't fall into sin when you are tempted. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Once more Yeshua went away and prayed the same thing. Then he came back. Again he found them sleeping. They couldn't keep their eyes open. They did not know what to say to him. Yeshua returned the third time. He said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is about to be handed over to sinners. Get up, let's go. Here comes the one who is handing me over to them." In these verses, we can read that Yeshua was aware of the will of the Eternal. He knew everything he would have to suffer. We can see here a counterpart to Kepha's attitude, because in this case, Yeshua listened to his Father and was sure to fulfill his will. Although we also see that he was in the condition of a man, that is to say that he did begin to become very distressed, very saddened, knowing the physical suffering that he was going to go through. We read in these verses that in this situation, he experienced his own being, he experienced in his own being an enormous sadness. In his heavenly condition as the Son of Elohim, he had not had to go through those afflictions. But in this moment, he was feeling the weight of all the iniquity of humanity. This attitude of the Messiah becomes a perfect example of what a complete surrender is. Because despite the fact that he was going through a very difficult time, he always put the will of the Eternal first. He denied himself becoming the obedient son to the point that he was put to death. In these verses, we can also read that the disciples were very tired and could not watch while Yeshua prayed. The Messiah exhorts them to watch and pray, so in that way they would not enter temptation. For as the Messiah said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. These words of the Messiah exhort us to prepare ourselves, to take care of our salvation with fear and trembling in obedience and holiness, just as the disciples did later on after the Messiah was delivered, and who in turn advised the rest of the people of the nation in their letters to put to death what is earthly and keep our garments clean. We can read this advice, these teachings in Colossians 3 verses 1 to 5, Romans 6 verses 1 and 2, and Romans 6 verses 11 to 13. And there's many other verses in the letters to the nations that are very useful or that help us understand better the importance of maintaining our garments clean and putting to death all the earthly things. Continuing with verses 43 to 65, it narrates about the arrest of Yeshua and that he was brought before the Sanhedrin to be judged. First, we can read that the arrest of Yeshua was unjust and led by his disciple Judah, who, when before giving him to the Roman authorities, he kissed him to hand him over. And this was in a way, or this was seen as a hypocritical way or a hypocritical act towards his teacher. But Yeshua did not want to defend himself. We can understand that with his authority, his power, he had the ability to pray to the Eternal so that he can send his angels to defend him. But we can read that he did not do so. He maintained himself humble. He accepted what was going on. He knew that he was on his way to fulfill the will of the Eternal. In other words, that he knew that the scriptures had to be fulfilled, and he just let what was necessary. He understood everything and he let it be. We read that during the trial, they raised false witnesses to accuse him of what he had been doing, teaching, saying, etc. But their testimonies did not agree with each other. But although they were raising false testimony towards Yeshua, he did not answer anything to defend himself from those who accused him. We read that the great minister repeatedly asked Yeshua if these accusations were true, where Yeshua responded that the Son of Man of the Eternal, Yeshua responded that he was the Son of the Eternal and that they would see him at the right hand of the majesty of the Eternal. This caused the great minister to tear his clothes and accuse him of blaspheming. In this whole event that happened with Yeshua and the Sanhedrin, we can see that they did not understand the prophecy that was being fulfilled, and the fact that they were being used to fulfill what had already been prophesied about the delivery of the Messiah. Furthermore, we can see that they did not want to accept that Yeshua was the Messiah that had been sent by the Eternal and that had been anointed by the Eternal. On the contrary, they were continue being filled with hatred and continued to envy the Messiah to the point that they took him to death. Finally, or to finalize today's study, verses 66 to 72, we can read the fulfillment of Kepha's denial towards the Messiah. We can read that Peter was following the Messiah from afar when he was arrested. He began to be afraid when the people who were in the Sanhedrin began to tell him and the rest of the people that he was one of the disciples of the Messiah. This fear of being discovered as a disciple of the Messiah and possibly also being sentenced to death led Peter to deny the Messiah 3 times, just as Yeshua told him that would happen in the previous verses. And just as we read in the previous verses, With the words of the Messiah, when the rooster crowed, Peter realized what he had done. He realized his foul. He realized his sin. He realized that he had denied the Messiah and that he had fulfilled what Yeshua said about him. This moment of reflection made him regret it, made him analyze the situation, and made him repent with sincerity. Because at that moment, his human weakness was made present, which was to be afraid of the men and what if they could have done. And although we do read that Peter did not remain in that state of shock or nor did he try to justify his action, but rather he recognized his mistake. He asked forgiveness for his failure, and it was not just talk, because we can see later on that he acted also. He started to live, he started to act, showing that true repentance. We can read in Peter's letters that he made a great effort to fulfill what Yeshua had commanded him, to remain obedient, to keep his garments clean, to put to death all the earthly things. He fulfilled his calling, which was to bring the message of redemption to the nations. And in that way, every soul can have the opportunity to return to the Creator and to live a full and pleasing life before our Creator. In the first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, we can read that he gives us a very, very valuable advice and lesson. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and exalt the Eternal on the day he visits." In all of this, it gives us a great teaching, taking the example of the Messiah, that going through a difficult situation, he understood his calling. He understood what had to be fulfilled. He maintained his trust in the Father. He maintained his obedience. He did not rebel. He trusted in the Eternal, which gives us a very, very valuable lesson of how we must act. That in every situation that we find ourselves, whether it's good or bad, we must maintain ourselves as those obedient sons and daughters. We must continue consecrating ourselves. We must always trust in the Eternal no matter what we go through. And another teaching another lesson that we receive from these chapters is taking the example of Peter. The importance of not acting on an emotion or on the situation that we're going through in that time, but rather analyze everything everything that is being said, and therefore act with maturity and with intelligence, with knowledge, and not with emotion. On the other hand, another lesson that we can receive, or that we can receive from this chapter, is the example of the religious people who continue with their iniquity, continued to have this hatred towards the Messiah. They did not want to accept, they did not want to see everything that was being prophesied, and that they had claimed that they had already analyzed and studied all the prophecies of the Eternal, but they did not want to accept Yeshua as the Messiah. Their ego was so high, their ego was greater than anything else, and therefore we're going to be seeing how they receive the consequences of their actions. And obviously these consequences were not good. So it teaches us to not act like that, to not act in egoism, to not think that we are always correct, to be able to see the things that are happening and to accept the things, and not try to reject everything that we're seeing being fulfilled. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time. And in the next study, we are going to be finalizing with this good news of Mark. Thank you very much once again, and bye.